Hey everyone, welcome to Mode Bespoke. I'm Atenas, and welcome to our first tutorial of the year. Today we are going to cover the basics of Tunisian crochet. So we're going to talk about hooks, we're going to cover 5 basic stitches, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some troubleshooting. So it will be a lengthy tutorial, but we are covering all the basics today, so let's get started. Tunisian crochet is a type of fiber art that is really very similar to crochet. However, when you create a Tunisian crochet pattern, you are using a lot of the techniques that you would use in regular crochet, but the pattern will look like it was knit. It is its own style, so you will require a specific set of tools to create a Tunisian crochet project. However, it does fit within that same family. So today I'm going to teach you how to crochet 5 basic Tunisian stitches. Now these stitches, you're probably going to see them in most of the Tunisian work that you're going to see. So you're going to see them all over the place, in Pinterest, in YouTube, anywhere that you look for a crochet project that is Tunisian, you will see these stitches. Now these are the building blocks that we're going to use for compound stitches that we're going to do here in the future here on this channel at least. We're going to work a lot of different projects that you need to know how to crochet these stitches before we can move on. So please practice these. I will show them to you here in depth, and it's going to be a lengthy tutorial, but we're going to go step by step so that you understand how to create these and all the different little tricks that these different stitches have. That way, as we move on to other more complex stitches, you'll be able to just breeze through these and learn the techniques for the more complicated compound stitches. And when I say compound stitches, I mean for things that we're going to use a combination of these and other stitches to create a different look. So we can create things like lace or like ribbing on a blanket, things like that. We're going to use a combination of stitches. So the 5 stitches we're going to learn today are the Tunisian simple stitch, knit stitch, purl, top loop, and full stitch. Also, I think it's known as the netting stitch. These may have other names depending on where you are. So if you're in a different country or you speak a different language, there's a variety of names for all of these. These are just the names that I know them as, and these are the names that I'm going to use for future tutorials. So if I refer to the Tunisian top stitch, know that it is this stitch, or a Tunisian simple stitch, know that it's this one. We're going to cover these in depth here. Now let's move on to the hooks part of this tutorial. So to work Tunisian crochet, you do need a specific type of hook. So you can do small work. So if you're going to do like a brim of a hat or something, you might be able to use a regular hook, but regular hooks are generally too small to use for Tunisian crochet, or this big section here in the middle will kind of impede you from making very even stitching. So you will need Tunisian crochet when working the majority of my patterns. So the variety of Tunisian crochets I have here, these are the ones at least that I will be using. They're very easy to find. If you cannot find them, go check out the Mode Bespoke shop. I'll link it down below. These are available there. So a few of these come in sets, but let's go over these hooks real quick. So the most common hook you're going to see is this one. So it looks like a knitting needle, and it has this little blunt end. So it's got a little stopper here. And then it has a hook at the top. This is the most commonly found Tunisian crochet hook. You can find this anywhere at Joann's, Michael's, Walmart, anywhere that they sell yarn or knitting and crochet supplies. You can find these. They do come in various sizes, and that's the same is true for all of these. You can find them in just about any size. So that's one. The second one, is going to be a double-ended hook. So see, it's got a crochet hook on either end. Now this one, you use it when you're going to do multiple colors. So if you're doing a 2-color, you're doing one row in one color and a second row in a different color, or when you're working in the round. So for bigger projects, I like to use this big one, but for smaller projects such as hats, socks, or anything a little smaller, I like to use a smaller double-ended hook. Now this one, you'll notice, has a flat center. I do use this, even though it does have the flat center, but I don't crochet a lot of stitching into it. So you're going to see it a lot on the channel, especially for Tunisian crochet hats worked in the round. You'll see this quite a bit. The last one I use a lot is this one, which is my bamboo hook, but it is a blanket hook. So it is much longer, than all of these hooks because it's got a really long plastic cord. So I mean, it just kind of keeps going. So I can crochet really large blankets with this Tunisian hook, which is something I can't do with a smaller hook like this one. I would have to crochet it in pieces and then sew it together. So a Tunisian blanket hook is really, really handy to have. All of these, like I said before, you can find them at the Mode Bespoke shop. All of the orders are fulfilled by Amazon, but these hooks specifically that I use are there. So go check that out. These two come in sets. So this one comes in a set of 8 and they're different sizes. So you can get really, really small ones and really, really big ones. So they come in a set of 8. This one I think comes in a set of 10. I can't remember if it's 10 or 12, but it starts at 3 millimeters, I believe, and it goes up to, I want to say 10. These are bamboo, so they are not very expensive. So you're going to find them online. They're not very expensive, but you may have to file down some of the edges. So I had to file down 2 of my hooks because they did snag a little bit, but you could just take a nail file and file them down. And they do come in a large set, and I really liked them. They're nice and soft and comfortable. So they're really nice. You're going to see this one a lot. The other one you can find in a set. So you can find these normally at the store. I see these on their own, so you have to buy them individually. But there is a set that I put up on the shop of these. So I think it's either 10 or 12. I get this one and the blanket bamboo hook. I get the listings confused, but it's either a set of 10 or 12 in all different sizes. But you can also find this on the shop. You will need the Tunisian hooks to crochet a lot of the projects that we're going to make here on the channel. For today, if you don't have one, you can't just use a regular hook. So just any regular crochet hook will work. We're only going to make a small sample, so we're going to use a chain of 10 stitches. So you should be able to fit that on a crochet hook and just practice working these Tunisian stitches. So let's grab some yarn and grab a hook and begin with the Tunisian simple stitch. So this is probably one of the most beautiful Tunisian basic stitches that I've seen. It is the most basic one, and it is probably the first one that everybody learns how to crochet. So we're going to start with that one, and we're going to begin with a slip knot. So all of these patterns, you're going to begin with a slip knot, and then we're going to do a foundation row, and they're all going to begin the same. But for a slip knot, all you have to do is just wrap the yarn around 2 fingers. So grab your yarn, wrap it around 2 fingers, and then you're going to pull this loop off your fingers. So see, we've got a little loop here. Now you're going to need to pass this long thread of yarn, so the one that you're working with, you're going to have to pass that through that loop. So pull it through the loop, like so, and then just tighten the knot. Now you just grab your crochet hook or your Tunisian crochet hook, and you are going to tighten the knot by pulling on the 2 threads. And there you go, you're ready to begin. So we're just going to start with a chain of 10. And to make a chain, you're going to yarn over. So to yarn over, you're going to wrap the yarn around your hook, and the yarn is passing behind the hook. So yarn over, you're going to pass this top loop through this bottom loop. And there's a chain. So that is 1. So we yarn over and pull through, and that's 2. Yarn over, pull through for 3. Yarn over, pull through, and that's 4. So here we go. Here are 4 chained stitches. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. We need a total of 10 just for the sample that we're crocheting. So I'm just going to crochet these really quickly, and then we can move on. But we're not going to be using multiples of anything. We're just going to practice all of our stitching for now. So this is what the stitches look like. See, they look like little V's. So there's one, and here's another. So we're going to begin our cast on here on the second stitch. So it's the second chain from your hook. You always want to skip this first stitch and work right into the second stitch, because if you work into the first stitch, you're going to uncrochet, if that's a word. You're going to unmake that first stitch that you made. So skip the first one, work into the second chain. All you do is just insert your hook into the stitch and you're ready to go. Now, for those of you that are just a little more advanced or have some experience with crochet, you can also work that first stitch into these back loops. So this is a back loop of the chain stitch. All you do is you find this first little loop, so it's the one behind that second stitch. So right in there, you're going to insert your hook into that stitch, and you're ready to go. By working on the back loops, you create a slightly more even and a little cleaner edge. So for everybody to see it a little bit better, just to keep it even here, and for all of our beginners, I'm going to work on the front of the chain. So we're just going to start on that second chain from the hook, and we are going to cast on. So I inserted the hook into the stitch, yarned over, and we're going to pull up a loop like so. If you didn't catch that, that's okay, we're going to do it again. We're going to insert our hook into the stitch, and then you're going to yarn over and pull that through the loop. So insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop. Insert your stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, and cast on. So this is called cast on. You're going to cast on one stitch for every stitch of your chain. And once you are done, I'll grab a little more yarn. Once you are done, your work is going to look like this. So we have cast on. So we have one loop for every stitch of our chain. So this is the very first part of a Tunisian crochet project. You always have to cast on, and then you're going to do one row that is called a return pass. So you're going to add stitches, and then you're going to remove them. So you will cast on and then return pass. We're going to do this over and over throughout the course of our project. So that is the difference here between regular crochet and Tunisian crochet, is that you cast on and then you have to remove stitches later. So now that you've completed your cast on, it is time to complete our very first return pass. So we have to get right back here to the first stitch. So we're going to do this same cast on for every one of our rows. So it is different for some different patterns, but for all of the stitches that we're going to crochet today, our return pass looks like this. You are going to yarn over, and you're going to pass this top loop through the very first loop on your hook. So yarn over and pull through 1. And then you are going to yarn over and pull through 2. So here are 2 loops. We're going to yarn over, pull through 1 and 2. Yarn over, pull through 2. And then yarn over, pull through 2. And you're going to continue to do this until you have 1 loop left on your hook. So just yarn over and pull through 2. The reason this very first one is different is because just like in regular crochet that you have a chain at the beginning of a row, it is the same for Tunisian crochet. So for this return pass, we only have to do a chain 1. So that's why we did yarn over and pull through 1. Now the rest of the stitch, or the rest of the row, I should say, you're going to yarn over and pull through 2 until you have 1 loop left on your hook. So there we go. So we have 1 loop left. Here it is. We've completed our first return pass. And now this first loop, as you can see, is the same as our first stitch of the row. So if you line them up, look, there's the first stitch of the row, and we have 1 loop on our hook. So you don't have to work the first stitch on any row. You're going to go right into that second stitch. And all of these stitches, or these little vertical stitches, are made up of 2 threads. So you have this back loop and the front loop. So you're going to hear me refer to them as front loop and back loop throughout the rest of the tutorial. So that is what I mean. So for this very first stitch, we're going to work in what is called the front loop. So it's going to be in the front of the work. So we're going to do that for most of the stitching that you're going to see for Tunisian crochet. So let's begin here with our Tunisian simple stitch. And for the Tunisian simple stitch, we're going to work in the front loop. So we're going to work into that second stitch. So skip the first one and right into the second stitch. We're going to grab the first loop. So insert your hook directly behind the front loop, like so. And then you are going to yarn over and you're going to pull up a loop. So there we go. We have cast on 1. Let's do it again in the next stitch. So insert your hook behind the front loop and then yarn over, and you're going to pull up a loop. And now you've cast on 2. insert your hook behind the front loop, yarn over, and pull up a loop. We've cast on 3. And that's all there is to it. So just continue to cast on in the front loop until you complete your row. So I'll do this nice and slowly so you can follow along. And now we have 2 loops or 2 stitches left. So here's the first one. There we go. And now for the final stitch of our row. It's this very last stitch. So it's this one. You can see here it is made up of 2 threads. So it's got the front loop and a back loop. And you're going to insert your hook behind both of those loops. So see, both loops are on our hook. You yarn over and pull up a loop. And there you go. So now we have cast on in a Tunisian simple stitch. And once you have cast on all of your stitches, we have to complete a return pass. So we have to get rid of all of these loops and go back to the very first stitch on our hook. So we will complete a regular return pass, and a regular return pass is just a yarn over, pull through 1 loop. So here we go, yarn over, pull through 1, and then we complete the rest of the pass by completing a yarn over and then pull through 2. So yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, and yarn over, pull through 2. And just continue until you have 1 loop left on your hook. And there we go. And we've completed a row of Tunisian simple stitch and a return pass. So now let's move on to another. We're going to do 1 more row of this. And remember, this first stitch, you skip it because you already have it on your hook. So we're going to start on this second vertical stitch. So you're going to insert your hook right behind that top vertical loop. So here it is. Yarn over and pull up a loop. So we have cast on 1. Insert the hook behind the top vertical loop, yarn over, and we have cast on 2. And then we're just going to complete this for every one of the stitches of this row. So this stitch is pretty easy. You just have to practice it a little bit. Okay, now that we've gotten to the very end of the row, so I wanted to show you this. It gets a little bit more difficult to see, but here we go. If you just move your stitches around, you'll be able to notice it right away. So you're going to notice 2 loops. So you have this end loop right over here, so that's that stitch, and then you have a chain right at the top. You want to crochet into this last stitch, and it's going to have 2 threads. So you're going to see this one right a little more towards the inside, and then the one at the end. The one at the end is made up of 2 loops. You want to insert your hook between both of those threads and right behind the 2 back loops. So those 2 loops at the end. And there you go. So that's what your stitch will look like at the end of the row. Once you have cast on all of your stitches, you have to complete a return pass. So just complete a regular return pass. And since we've covered it a few times, I'm not going to go over it for the remainder of the tutorial. So when I say complete a return pass, you just yarn over, pull through 1, and then yarn over, pull through 2 until you finish the whole pass. And there you go. It's that simple. That was the Tunisian simple stitch. So continue practicing this stitch and complete several repetitions of this. So cast on and complete several return passes until you get a little bit length of work. Once you do, you're going to notice that your work starts to curl up. So this is really normal in Tunisian crochet. Not all of your stitches will curl up. So your Tunisian simple stitch does, but when we move on to the purl, you're going to notice that the purl stitch lays flat. So it just depends on the stitch that you are working on. At the end of the tutorial, I will cover some troubleshooting, and we will talk about how to remove the curl from your Tunisian project. But as you are practicing, know that it is normal for your Tunisian work to curl up. So just keep on working and keep on practicing the Tunisian simple stitch. Now we're going to move on to the Tunisian knit stitch, and it's pretty much in the name. It looks like it is knit. So it is very similar to a knitting knit stitch, and we're just going to complete it here by skipping this first stitch. So remember that we already have this on the hook. We're going to go into the second stitch. Now for this stitch, we're going to go in between both of those threads of yarn, so the front loop and the back loop, but you're going to push your hook all the way towards the back, like so. And then you are going to yarn over and pull up a loop. So now if you notice, the yarn went in between both threads of that stitch. So now let's cast on another knit stitch. So we're going to insert the hook right in between both of those threads and all the way through the back of our work. And then we're going to yarn over and pull up a loop. So we have cast on 2. Let's go into the next stitch and we're going to insert our hook in between the loops all the way to the back, yarn over and pull up a loop for 3. And you're going to continue to cast on your stitches until you get to the end of the row. So once you reach the last stitch, so look for the stitch here at the end, you're going to cast on that stitch like we have the other end stitches. So the same way that we did the Tunisian simple stitch. So just insert your hook behind the 2 end loops and pull up a loop. And there you go, you're ready to go. So now all you do is just complete a return pass, and that is a regular return pass, which is a yarn over, pull through 2, all the way to the end of the row. And then we're going to do one more repetition of this row so that we can see it one more time, and we'll move on to our next stitch. So remember that you always skip that first stitch. Going into the second one, we're going to go in between both of those threads of yarn. So insert your hook right in between the 2 loops, and then you're going to yarn over and cast on a loop. So we've cast on 1, go into the next stitch, right in between both threads of the loop, of the stitch, and then you insert your hook, yarn over and pull up the loop, and we're going to do the same in all of the following stitches. So just continue to cast on the rest of your stitches. Don't forget that very last stitch of the row, complete a return pass, and then we're ready to begin with our next stitch. So our next stitch is the purl stitch. So here's our little sample. This one, as you can see, lays flat, so it doesn't curl up like the knit stitch or the Tunisian simple stitch. But the knit stitch is nice and thick, and you can use it to create a lot of different patterns. So you will see the stitch a lot. So you'll see this one and the knit stitch. So pay close attention to these two because we're going to be using it very many times over the course of the next couple of tutorials. So let's get started here, and we're going to skip the first stitch. We're going to go into the second stitch, and we're going to insert our hook behind that front loop. However, this time we have to yarn over, and it is not a regular yarn over, so that's a regular one. When you pass the yarn behind the hook, we're going to do a reverse yarn over. So we're going to yarn over in front of the hook, like so. And then I like to hold it down with my index finger, just to keep the stitch from slipping off of my hook. So reverse yarn over, hold it down with your index finger, and then in the second stitch, you're going to insert your hook behind that front loop. So there's the front loop, insert your hook right behind it. So you're going to be crocheting into the hook similar to how we were crocheting for the Tunisian simple stitch. So just behind that back loop. And now you're going to release the yarn you were holding with under your index finger, loop it in front of your work and behind your crochet hook so that it's going to create this little loop right underneath the stitch. And then you yarn over, and this is a regular yarn over. Yarn over and pull that through that top loop on your hook. There you go. And that is a purl stitch. Let's do another one again. So you are going to start with a reverse yarn over. So wrap the yarn around your hook in front of the hook. Hold it down with an index finger, and you're going to insert your hook into the stitch. You're going to use the front loop. And then you're going to release the yarn you're holding with your index finger, loop it in front of your crochet work and behind your hook. And then you do a regular yarn over. So wrap the yarn behind your hook, like so, and then pull that top loop through the first loop on your hook. So reverse yarn over, insert the hook into the stitch, release your yarn, pull it behind your hook, and then do a regular yarn over. So just a regular yarn over behind the hook and pull that yarn over. So this top loop you made with the yarn over through the top loop on your hook. And there you go. So I'm going to complete the rest of this row really slowly, just so that everyone can follow along. But it is a little, I think this is one of the complicated Tunisian stitches, simply because it's got a couple of added steps, and it's got two different types of yarn over. So it's a front yarn over or a reverse yarn over, and then just a regular yarn over or a back yarn over. So practice this one. You are going to use it in the next two patterns, so be really, really comfortable with it. Now let me crochet this last purl stitch, and we're at the end of the row. So now the row you can finish in two ways. You can finish it the same way that we had finished all of the other rows. So you can just do that knit stitch into the very last stitch of the row. Or you can finish it in a purl. Since we have already practiced how to end the row the first way, I'm just going to end this in a purl just to show you what it would look like. So that way it'll also match all of these other stitches. So just like you start with a purl, you do a reverse yarn over. You're going to insert your hook right behind those two loops, right there at the end of the row. And then you release your yarn, and you're going to loop it under and behind your hook. And then you yarn over, it's a regular yarn over, and pull through both of the loops that make up that last stitch. And then you just pull on your thread a little to tighten up that purl stitch. And there you go. Complete a return pass, and then we're going to complete one more row of purl stitch for any of you guys that need to see that one more time. So there we go, we're at the end of the row. Let's complete another row of Tunisian purl stitch. So we're going to reverse yarn over, and we're going to insert our hook into that front loop of the second stitch. Pull our yarn in front of our Tunisian work and behind the hook. Complete a yarn over, and then complete the stitch. So reverse yarn over, insert that into the hook, pull your yarn behind your hook, yarn over, and then pull through the stitch. So I'll continue working these slowly until we get to the end of the row so you can get a little bit more practice in. And now that we've gotten to this last stitch, we're just going to finish that with a purl stitch as well. So let me move this a bit so you can see it. We're going to do the reverse yarn over. So I'll do it nice and slow. Insert a hook behind those two last loops of the final stitch, and then pull our yarn under and behind our hook. And then grab a regular yarn over. We're going to pull that loop through the two loops that make up that last stitch. So our yarn over goes through both of those loops. And there is our row. So now just complete a return pass. So moving on to the Tunisian top loop stitch. This is one of my favorite Tunisian crochet stitches. It is quite simple to crochet once you get the hang of it. So it does have a bit of a trick. You do have to skip a couple of stitches here and there in order to make a perfectly square project. But like I said, once you get the hang of it, it moves pretty quickly and it looks really, really nice. You will need some stitch markers for this, or at least I recommend that you use some stitch markers just to help you keep track of the stitches we're going to be skipping. So let me grab my yarn here. All right, so this one's going to be a little different than the stitches that we've been working on, because while we've been working on the vertical stitches, so all of these little vertical posts, for this stitch, we're going to work on the chain. So this chain that's right in between the vertical stitches up here, we're going to be working on that top loop of the chain. So for this stitch, you really need to pay close attention to the stitches that we're going to be skipping, because we're going to skip a stitch every other row in order to avoid increases in our work. So let's get started here. For this first stitch, we're going to skip that first chain and go into the second one. So insert your hook into the second chain, so that top loop right in here, go. So we're going to work up here, and then you're just going to yarn over and pull up a loop. So we cast on one. And now go into the next chain space, and you're going to insert your hook into the top loop of the chain. So into that top stitch. Yarn over and pull up a loop. So see, we're not working in the vertical posts, so those are going to look a little bit long. So in that next chain, we're going to do the same. Insert your hook into that top stitch, and then yarn over and pull up a loop. And continue casting on into each of the chains of this row. So I've made it to the end of the row, and I'm here at the last chain stitch. So between the last two vertical posts, there's that chain. We're going to insert a hook into that one, and we're also going to insert our hook into that last stitch of the row. So it's the chain right below the one that you just crocheted into. And there we go. So now you're going to be ready for your return pass. But now the part of this stitch that you have to keep in mind is that if you don't skip that first stitch or the last stitch, which we're going to skip in the next row, you're going to end up with an extra stitch. So instead of being the 10 stitches that we need, so see, we have 10 stitches right here, you're going to end up with 11 stitches. So you're going to slowly increase your stitch. So the width of your project is going to start increasing, and you're going to end up with a triangle. So pay close attention here, because you are going to be skipping a stitch. So for this row, we skipped the first stitch. And then for the next row, we're going to skip the last stitch. So in all of your odd numbered rows, skip the first stitch, and all of your even numbered rows, you skip the last stitch. So this is where those stitch markers come in handy. So in order to help you keep track of where you're at, I would just grab a stitch marker and put it into the stitch that you skipped. So this last row, we skipped that first stitch. So I'm just going to put a stitch marker there so I know that I skipped that stitch. So then I can complete my return pass, and then at the beginning of next row, I will know where to start, where the first stitch of my row has to be. So this will all make sense a little bit here in just a moment. So we have to work into that first stitch now because we put that stitch marker here. So that told us that we skipped it in the last row. So in this row, we will cast on into that very first chain of the row. So here's our first vertical stitch. We're going to crochet into the chain right next to that. So insert your hook, pull up a loop, and there we go, we've cast on one. And now we're just going to continue to cast on into every stitch until we get towards the end. Because in this row, since it is row number 2, I don't count the return passes as a row, but since this is row number 2 for cast on, we will have to skip this last stitch. So here we go. We have our last vertical stitch and then the very last stitch of the row. So here is that last chain. We're going to skip it and crochet right into that last stitch. So just like how we skipped this first stitch in the first row, we're going to skip this last stitch in this row. So insert your hook into the last stitch of the row, yarn over and pull up a loop, and there we go. So you're going to have a little bit of a space there, but if you count your stitches, we will have 10. So there we go, which is exactly what we needed. Now, if we would have forgotten and we would have crocheted into that second to last stitch, so right there and into the last stitch, we would have ended up with 11 stitches, which is one more than what we started with. Now, if you were to crochet into that second to last stitch and you decided to just stop there because you already had 10 stitches, you start to lose some of the shape in your work and it's no longer a straight square. So always skip that second to last stitch and crochet into the last stitch just to keep your rows nice and clean and even. So let me complete this return pass, and there we go. And now you can either grab a second stitch marker and put it on that stitch, or you can just move the first stitch marker you had. So that way, if you have to set your work down, you'll know what to do in the following row. So you won't get so lost. So I do recommend these stitch markers. Now, what happens if you don't skip any of the stitches? Well, you're slowly going to start to increase your work, and it's just going to be 1 stitch per row, but eventually you'll end up with a bit of a trapezoid kind of shape to your work. So if you were to skip a stitch, whether it's the one in the front or the one in the back, and you do this for every single row, you're going to affect the direction in which your work tilts. So if you skip the back stitch, it's going to tilt to the left, and that's if you skip the back stitch every row. If you skip the front stitch in every row, it's going to tilt towards the right. So that's why we alternate between skipping a stitch in the front and a stitch in the back. That way your work will stay a nice, neat square instead of tilting in diagonal directions. So your stitches will still be facing up, so they'll face the same direction, but your work will start to tilt. So that's something to keep in mind there. So that's why we're using the stitch markers and alternating between the rows that we skip. So now let's move on to the Tunisian full stitch, or the netting stitch as I've also seen it called. And this one is very similar to the one we just did. This one always gave me a lot of trouble when I first started Tunisian crochet, but it's got a very similar skip pattern to it that we did in the previous stitch. So for this one, it might also be helpful to have a stitch marker because we are going to be alternating skip stitches like we did before. So just grab 1 or 2 stitch markers, whatever you prefer. You don't need one for every single row, but as long as you have one to move around to help you keep track of what row you skipped on, you should be all right. So now let's get started here with this very first stitch. For this stitch, we're going to be working in the chain space. So before we worked in the chain stitch, this time we're going to work in the chain space. So this little gap right here in between all of the stitches. So this is the first row of our stitch, so it is an odd numbered row. We are going to skip the very first chain space, and we're going to work into the second one. So skip this one and work into the second chain space, not the chain stitch. So you're going to insert your hook between the vertical stitches, like so. So not in the chain, in the actual little gap, so the chain space. You're going to yarn over and pull up a loop. So we have cast on 1. Now go into the second chain space, so the one right after that. Yarn over and pull up a loop. Go into the one after that, insert your hook, yarn over and pull up a loop. So I'm just going to continue to pull up a loop. So I'm just going to cast on 1 for every stitch of the row. And since we're only working in the chain space, it moves along pretty quickly until we get to this last stitch. So we skipped the first one. We are not going to skip this last stitch. So we're going to work a stitch into that last chain space. So there's 1. And we're also going to work a stitch in that last stitch of the row. So right back here, that also gets a stitch. So, and if you don't remember where you're at, just count the number of loops on your hook. You should have the same number as the chain that you made, so as your initial chain. So you should have 10 loops because we made a chain of 10. So there we go. I go through, count them, just make sure you have 10 loops, and then you're just going to complete a return pass. So it's going to be a regular return pass. So I'm going to finish up my return pass. Then we're ready to start our second row. So in the first row, we skipped that first stitch. So I'm just going to place a little pink stitch marker here so we don't confuse it with the orange ones that we worked on in the last stitch. And since we skipped this very first stitch in the previous row, we're going to work that, our very first stitch of the row, we're going to work that into that stitch that we skipped. So the one with the stitch marker. So beginning on that first chain space of the row, we're going to begin our first cast on. So insert our hook into that first chain space, and then in the second one and pull up a loop, third, pull up a loop, and then you're just going to pull up a loop for every one of the stitches here until we get to that last stitch. So here's that last chain space. Remember that we cast on into that very first one, so in the second row, because it is also an even numbered row, we're going to skip that last chain space and work directly into that last stitch of the row. So now we skipped that back stitch. Then we're going to work a return pass. First, let me just make sure we have 10 stitches and we're good. So now we yarn over, pull through 1, and then yarn over, pull through 2 until we complete the return pass. So here at any point you can just stop and move your stitch marker, or here you can finish the row and then move it, but I'm just going to remove all of these stitch markers just to make it less confusing. You can just do this entire work and just have one stitch marker to help guide you. It really makes a difference when you're working on this stitch. This was one of the first stitches I learned for Tunisian crochet, and I think the stitch marker would have made a huge difference because I kept forgetting where I was skipping and where I was adding the stitch. So my work ended up really lopsided. So being that this was the first Tunisian crochet stitch I tried, it was really frustrating. And I just had to put everything away, and I didn't try Tunisian crochet again for like another year. So I highly recommend the stitch marker. Just place it on the stitch that you skipped, and that way you know that in the next row you have to stitch into that stitch with the stitch marker. So now I know that for this next row right over here, I will have to skip the first stitch since there's no stitch marker there. I have to crochet into that stitch with the stitch marker. So here we go. So let's do this one row together again. So here's the stitch marker on the last stitch. That tells me that I have to skip the first stitch of the row. So I have to skip this one. And then I just pull up a loop and cast on the second chain space of the row. And now when I get to the end, here's my stitch marker. I'm going to crochet into that stitch. And I'm also going to crochet into the last stitch of the row. So the little stitch marker is just kind of a little flag that says, hey, you need to crochet into this stitch. So then we just complete a return pass. And there we go. Now we can move our stitch marker to the other side. So it seems a little ridiculous when you're doing this small sample, but when you're working a big project like a blanket, even if it's a baby blanket that isn't too large, this stitch marker will really help you. So see, now when we begin our next row, I'm going to crochet into the stitch, into that first stitch, and then just complete the rest of my work. So there we go. That is the Tunisian full stitch. I think it's a very beautiful stitch. It's just one that is a little tricky. Just like with this top loop stitch, when you crochet the full stitch, if you always skip the front stitch, your work is going to tilt to the right, and if you skip the last stitch, it's going to tilt to the left. So alternate between skipping a stitch in the front and a stitch in the back, because your stitches will all still face the same direction, so they'll still be up facing you in a vertical direction, but your work is just going to tilt diagonally. So no amount of blocking is going to help straighten out your work. So just remember to alternate the stitch that you skip. So one in the front and then one in the back every other row. Okay, so now that we have covered the 5 different stitches, we're going to have to cover one last thing. So let me complete this return pass, and we're going to start to talk about a bind off. Let's take a look at our stitches, and if you notice, there are these big spaces left behind up here. And if this is the last row of your work, you're going to want to close it off. Here, you are going to complete a bind off. Now, for the bind off, I use 2 stitches typically, and one of them is a slip stitch, and the other is a single crochet. And these are just regular crochet stitches, but these are the 2 I like to use for the bind off, although there are very many different ways you can bind off, just like how you can in knitting. It just really depends on the stitch, it depends on the pattern. There are several different factors, but I'm going to teach you the 2 most common ways the 2 most common stitches that I use for a bind off. So you're on the last row of your work, you've already completed your return pass, and we're ready to just finish the work. We're going to skip that first stitch, and we're going to insert our hook into the second vertical stitch, just like you would if you were crocheting a knit stitch. So insert your hook in between both threads of yarn. And then you're going to yarn over, and you're going to pull up a loop. So now you have 2 loops on your hook. So for the slip stitch, you're going to slip this top loop through the bottom loop. So it's just a regular crochet slip stitch. And that's it. So now we're going to go into the next stitch. So make sure you're going through the stitch that has both the front and a back loop, and go right in between both loops and all the way through the back of the work like you would a knit stitch. Yarn over and pull up a loop. And then you're going to pull this top loop through the bottom loop to slip stitch. Let's do one more together. Insert our hook between the loops of the stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, and then slip stitch. So top loop through the bottom loop. And there we go. And complete, what, one or two more? I think, yeah, just one more. So that's what it'll look like. So as you can tell, now we don't have these big old gap spaces that are just open at the top of our work. Now it's nice and neat and closed up, and you can finish your work there. Now the second stitch I use is just a single crochet. This is just a regular crochet, single crochet. There's nothing special about it. You're going to insert your hook in between the loops of the stitch, again, just like you would a knit stitch, and you're going to pull up a loop. Now you have two loops on your hook. You're going to yarn over and pull through both loops to create a single crochet. So insert your hook, yarn over, pull up a loop. We have two loops on our hook, and then you yarn over and pull through both loops. So insert your hook into the stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, and pull through two. So you're going to want to do that in that last stitch too. So whether you're doing a slip stitch bind off or a single crochet bind off, don't forget that very last stitch of the row, because otherwise you're going to have a bit of a gap right here. So I don't know if you can see that space. So don't forget that last stitch. Bind off on that stitch as well. And there you go. So here's a closer look on it. So the single crochet is just a little bit taller than the slip stitch, but the look of it will depend on a couple of different factors. So one of them is the stitch that you were working. So it will look very different to bind off in a single crochet if you're doing a purl stitch than if you're doing a knit stitch. Same goes for the slip stitch. It'll also depend on what type of yarn you are using. So a bulkier yarn will look different than a super fine yarn. So just give it a shot. Try the bind off on every one of your samples. So try to do these samples individually and then test a different bind off. So test a single crochet bind off and then do a slip stitch bind off and see which one you like best. So now for a little bit of troubleshooting. And these are just some of the questions that I frequently get whenever I do a Tunisian crochet project. And the first one, which is probably the most common one, has to do with the curl. So Tunisian crochet, most of the stitches have a tendency to curl up. So they'll curl up like this. So you're just working along and your work just starts to curl for inexplicable reasons. A lot of that has to do with the type of stitching that you're doing. So if you're working with a front loop, it'll start to pull your work into itself. There's also the factor of your hook. So sometimes your hook is too small, and what happens is that your knitting just has a really, really tight tension, so it pulls into itself. So one way you can get rid of the curl is to use a bigger hook. So work a couple of rows, just always work a small sample in the yarn that you're working with, and then just try different sized hooks until you find one that it lays flat. Now, if you want to use a smaller hook size because you want a tighter knit, and you're still going to get the curl, you can do what is called blocking. Now, you can block this in several ways. The first of which is you just lay out a towel, and then you're going to soak your work. So soak it in a bucket of water. If you want to add something like fabric softener to it just to soften up the stitches a little, you can do that. Wring it out and then lay it on a towel. And then you're going to grab some pins and just pin around your work and pin it down in the way you want it to dry. So depending on how tightly knit your work was, you may have to do this 2 or 3 times. So that is blocking. A second way of blocking is steam blocking. So you can do this with either a handheld steamer or your iron. And this, you have to pay attention to the type of yarn you have, because if you have acrylic or polyester or something, you really want to be careful with this one. Because if you use an iron that has a steam function, what you're going to do is you're going to lay out a towel and you're going to pin your work down. So you want to pin it down in the way you want it to dry. So if you have an extra stitch you have to pull out, or just a little area that you have to fill in, just move your crochet work and lay it the way you want to. And then grab your iron and turn on the steam function. And what you're going to do with your iron is just lay it close to your work. So don't iron it. So don't touch the iron to the actual crochet work. Hold it up, maybe about an inch over your work, and then just pass it through 2 or 3 times. put your iron down and then massage the work a little bit. Just loosen up the stitching. Be very careful when you do this. It is going to be hot, so please be careful. But steam a little section and then move the stitches around just to loosen them up, and then steam another section and do the same. This will take a little while, but I found it is the most effective way of blocking. So I do this whether it's cotton or acrylic, anything like that. Now the last way to get rid of the curl is to crochet a row of single crochets. So 1 or 2 rows of single crochets at the bottom part of your work and the top will work just fine. Now you can either start your work by crocheting a row of single crochets and then start the Tunisian work, or you can complete your Tunisian work and then single crochet around it like you would a border. So just do a quick border, 1 or 2 rows of single crochet, and it'll help lay your work flat. So that's how to get rid of the curl, which is the biggest question I get. Now, the second question I get often is increases. So that used to happen to me a lot as well. So as I would go crocheting along, I would just start increasing, and one side would start to get a little bit wider, or my work would start to look a bit like a trapezoid. And that, if it starts to open up, it means that you are adding stitches. Usually, the most common place to add a stitch is at the beginning of a row. So sometimes you forget not to work that first stitch, or you just end up working 2 stitches in that one up into the second stitch. I don't know why that happens, but generally for me the problem is that very first stitch. Just pay close attention. That's really all you can do, is just count the number of stitches that you're crocheting. Make sure you're not adding stitches in the front or in the back, because then it'll open up your work. So increases, those are just accidental increases. The other question I get is decreases. So instead of opening up, it starts to work into itself. So you end up with a bit of a triangle at the top. When that happens, that means you've skipped stitches. And again, those tend to be at the front of the row or at the end of a row. So you'll start to see your work leaning in. So on either side. So just pay close attention to that as well. A lot of the time you can also tell by just looking at the stitch. So with the Tunisian simple stitch, you have straight lines and you can see exactly where you skipped a stitch. So with just a little practice, you can eliminate those problems. Now, for the very last tip I've got here is something that happens to me often, is that when I begin my Tunisian crochet work, the beginning stitches are usually really, really loose. And at the end of the row, since I can usually tighten the last few stitches, the back stitches are going to be very tight and the front stitches are going to be pretty loose. So in order to fix that problem, I've learned to just loosen up the back stitches. So once you complete the entire row, so you've cast on a stitch for every stitch of the row, I just pull on my hook just to loosen up the stitches at the end. So I just kind of pull up on it, loosen up the stitches a little bit, and then I complete my return pass. And what that'll do is it'll keep these stitches from the front and the back even. So instead of just the front stitches, the first few stitches of your row, they won't be all loose, while the stitches at the end are really, really tight. So it'll keep your work nice and even. But that's it for our tutorial for today, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this Tunisian 101 course. I try to cover everything. I know it was pretty long, but please practice these stitches. We are going to be using them a lot, and I will refer back to this video tutorial in case you ever need to come back and practice. If you still have any questions after you've practiced a little bit, leave them down in the comment section, or you can always shoot me an email. I'm happy to help. I can also create different tutorials for any of the other issues that you might have with your Tunisian project. So whether it's you want to learn to block something, or you need help with an explanation of something else, just let me know what that is and I'll add that to the list of tutorials so that I can create a more comprehensive 101 Tunisian crochet course for you guys. So now for the next couple of weeks, we are going to work on some very beginner projects. So we're going to be making some mittens, some socks, and a poncho. So be prepared for that. Please practice the knit stitch and the purl stitch. You are going to use them a lot in the next 2 projects. So practice those, and that's it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button. I post videos every week. Go check out our Instagram page where I post photos of all the projects we're going to be working on here on YouTube, as well as all of the patterns that are available on the website, and that is modebespoke.com. Go check that out. I also have a shop there. Check out all the links there in the description box below. Don't forget to like and share the video if you have enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching, you guys, and I will see you all again next week.